So in this video, I'm going to give you some background to the reading from David Hume and the subject that he's talking about, which is basically the problem of evil. And that will put you in a position to do take the quiz, and then you can watch the rest of the videos on Hume to get a fuller understanding of his view. So David Hume was a philosopher, lived 1711 to 1776. He was a contemporary of Paley. He was Scottish, Scotland being directly north of England. He's one of the best philosophers ever, so it's nice that we get to read him. He was officially agnostic, meaning that he said we don't know whether or not God exists, but he may have secretly been atheist. It's likely that he was, but why would he not say so? Well, in his time period, atheism was considered very evil, and he would have gotten in a lot of trouble up to the point of being imprisoned and possibly killed if he had publicly been atheist. And so he had a lot of reason to not say he was atheist, even if he was. So we're going to be reading a selection from his dialogues concerning natural religion, and we're reading a section that's sort of fairly far into the dialogues, and so we need a little bit of context in order to understand what's going on at that point in the dialogues. So Hume is concerned, among other things, with the problem of evil. The problem of evil is a variety of arguments that attempt to show that God does not exist. So the most basic form of the argument is this. Premise 1, if God exists, there is no evil. Premise 2, there is evil. Conclusion, God does not exist. So we want to ask, is this sound? That is it valid, and are its premises true? It's certainly valid. If God exists, there is no evil. Well, that means if there is evil, then the second part of that is false, and that means that the first part of it would have to be false as well, and that would mean that God does not exist, and the premise says the second part of the first premise is false. So if both the premises are true, the conclusion is false, or excuse me, the conclusion is true, and God does not exist. Are the premises true? Is the argument sound, though, given that it's valid? When the second premise seems true, it does seem like there's evil. What about the first premise? If God exists, there is no evil. There's also some reason to believe that the first premise is true. The first premise saying, if God exists, there is no evil. Why? Well, if God exists, then God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and purely good. That's at least according to the conception of God that we're working with. Well, suppose there is an all-powerful, all-knowing, and purely good being. What would it act like? Well, it could and would prevent all evil. All evil is not good. It acts to prevent all evil because it's purely good. It's all-knowing, so it knows what is required to prevent that evil, and it's all-powerful. It can prevent that evil. So it wants to prevent the evil, and it doesn't have any other competing goals. It knows what's necessary to prevent the evil, and because it's all-powerful, it can prevent the evil. So it will prevent the evil, and so there's no evil. At least so it seems. But actually, there's some reason to think that the first premise is false. A lot of people think we have free will. It's up to us to do it's up to us to decide what to do, and we can always choose to do otherwise than we actually do. So one might think that shows that the first premise is false. Maybe God has given some of her creatures free will, and we sometimes use that free will in evil ways. Well, if that were true, then P1 would be false. If we have free will and use it in evil ways, and God has given us free will, then God does exist, and yet there's evil, the evil choices, at least, that we make. But it's possible that P1 is false, something like P1 is true. So we can distinguish between moral evil and natural evil. What's moral evil? Moral evil would be evil choices and the evil consequences of evil choices. Natural evil would be basically everything else, all the other evil, and it would include things like diseases and earthquakes and hurricanes and their evil effects. So we might then think, okay, well, here's the revised problem of evil argument. Premise 1, if God exists, there is no natural evil. We think if God exists, maybe there could be moral evil. That's the free will evil. But that doesn't show there could be natural evil. So maybe if God exists, there is no natural evil. But premise 2, there is natural evil. So conclusion, God does not exist. So this is a valid argument. Is it sound? Well, that depends upon whether or not the premises are true. The second premise seems true. What about the first? Is the first premise true? Is our new premise true? Well, let's think about it. So we can distinguish between avoidable evil and unavoidable evil. What's the difference? Well, avoidable evil, let's consider an example of avoidable evil. So you go to the dentist and you get a cavity filled, and you get it filled without Novocaine, and it's very painful. This pain would be avoidable evil. It's evil, it's painful, it's very bad, and it could have been avoided. How? By using Novocaine. So that's avoidable evil. Unavoidable evil, well, you get a cavity filled, and that's to your benefit. It's much better to have it filled than not. But to have it filled, you have to have dental stuff in your mouth, at least right now. Maybe in the future it will be easier to fill a cavity, but right now the only way to get the cavity filled is there's this stuff being jammed in your mouth, and there's lots of noise, and you can't move, and so on. That's unpleasant. It's evil. It's not a big evil, but, it's evil. So that evil would be unavoidable evil. It's good to have the cavity filled. You can't get the cavity filled without having these unpleasant experiences, but it's definitely worth it. So that's unavoidable evil. Okay, right, there's no way to have the cavity filled and get the benefits of that without having the unpleasant, stuff in your mouth and noises and all of that. So you might think, okay, yeah, maybe there is natural evil, but it's all unavoidable. Maybe it's all like the dental instruments. This natural evil is needed to make the world run well. Without it, the world would run worse. And so, yeah, God makes the world as good as possible, but in order to do that, it's going to include this natural evil, and that makes that natural evil unavoidable. And that means it would be false that if God exists, there is no natural evil. If God exists, then the world is maybe as good as it could be, but that's going to include natural evil. It's going to include the unavoidable natural evil. And so what we would say instead is this: if God exists, all natural evil is unavoidable. Right, so is there evil? Yes, there's going to be moral evil, and there's also going to be natural evil. And all the natural evil, though, is going to be of the unavoidable kind. And now we can state a final version of the problem of evil argument. Namely, if God exists, there is no natural avoidable evil. Right? If God exists, maybe there's evil, but there isn't any evil that's both natural and avoidable. But premise 2, there is avoidable natural evil, and so God does not exist. This is a valid argument. Premise 1 seems like it's probably true. So Hume is going to say that premise 2 is true as well, and that is going to, at least it's probably true, and that's going to make that would produce a sound argument if he were right. So premise 2, some natural evil is avoidable. Hume thinks there's good reason to believe this. You're going to see that in the reading. But you need to understand, it's important to understand that, first of all, that's what he's arguing for, and it's in the context of this bigger argument that looks like it would show that God does not exist. But he also expresses hesitation about premise 2. One reason is just that Hume is very, in general, skeptical. He thinks, look, it's very hard for us to know anything, for us to be certain of anything, and that would be true of premise 2 in particular, so we can't be certain about premise 2. So we need to understand the distinction between a priori and a posteriori, what is that? What are these funny words? Well, so here are a couple of claims. It's sunny today, I am tall, the sun is at the center of the solar system. So we can know all of these when they're true. They may not be true, but we can discover whether or not they're true, and when they are true, we can know that they're true. Well, but in discovering them, what do? Well, among other things, we're going to rely on sensory experiences, vision, hearing, touch, and so on. And that reliance makes these what we call a posteriori. To know that they're true, we rely on sensory experience. What about some other claims, like 2 plus 1 is 3, if it's raining, a triangle has 3 sides, or 2 plus 1 is 4, that last one being false. Well, for each of these to know whether or not they're true or false, we don't actually rely on sensory experiences. Maybe, right, so if it's raining, I don't need to know whether or not it's raining. I don't need to hear the rain or see the rain. Maybe, in fact, it's not raining. That conditional, the way it works is it says if it's raining, so consider the situations in which it is raining. Is it raining? Well, yeah, I just told you we're looking at the situations in which it is. You don't need to do any sensory investigation. A triangle has 3 sides? Yeah, that's part of the definition of being a triangle. 2 plus 1 equals 3? Yeah, 1 is the first number, 2 is the second number, 3 is the third number. Plus 1 moves you to the next number, so 2 plus 1 is, 2 is the second number, plus 1 takes me to the third number, and that's 3. And whereas I can see in a similar way that 2 plus 1 is 4. So these claims are called a priori. Okay, so there's this distinction. How do we know whether or not the claim is true? Do we need to rely on sense experience or not? If we do rely on sense experience, then it's a posteriori. If we don't rely on sense experience, it's a priori. So, although Hume thinks there are no a priori, no successful sound a priori arguments for God, he mentions them a bunch of times. Because why? Well, suppose there were a sound a priori argument that God exists, right? We would be able to tell just from the idea of God that God exists. Well, that would mean that we would have reason to think that all natural evil is unavoidable, right? We can tell from the idea of God that God exists. We can tell from the idea of God that God would never make any unavoidable evil, at least any unavoidable natural evil. And so when we see natural evil, we would have reason to think it's unavoidable because God has allowed it to exist. We might not know why it's unavoidable. We might not understand why. The world is complicated and we can't tell. But we would have reason to say, oh, well, look, that's natural evil. God has allowed it. It must be unavoidable. We wouldn't understand why it's unavoidable. But as I've been saying, Hume thinks that such an argument doesn't exist. That is, he doesn't think there's a sound a priori argument that God exists. So he mentions this point several times, and I marked it in the text where he says, oh, look, maybe if there were a sound a priori argument that God exists, then my own arguments would be in trouble, but there isn't one. And this is what he's talking about. He's saying, imagine that from the mere idea of God, we could figure out that God exists, then my reasoning wouldn't work, but there is no such argument, and so my reasoning does work. My reasoning is okay. Okay, so to pull together this video and what you need to know about reading Hume. So Hume is critical of the design argument. He thinks it does not work. He more or less advocates the problem of evil, which would, as we've said it, shows that God does not exist. As Hume puts it, it would show that God is not good. He's going to argue for the idea that there is avoidable natural evil, and he's confident but not certain of that claim. And then there's this complicated business about the a priori stuff. So there is not an a priori argument for God's existence, according to Hume, but if there were, Hume's argument for avoidable natural evil would fail, and he points that out a couple of times. And that's marked in the version of the text that I have uploaded. So now you're ready to go ahead and read the text and then take the quiz on the reading and then watch the rest of the videos on Hume. So good luck with all of that.